Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 2 of our story. And we are establishing that these two young boys have lived at Ravenscroft before, and for some reason they're going to have to return there. And it sounds as if Ravenscroft is a very formidable place. So we're about to learn about what's going to happen there. So let's continue with part 2 of our story. I guess you're wondering how my father died, and that would be a reasonable question for you to ask. But I hasten to say, I really am probably as clueless as you are about it. One day my father simply went off to work like he did every other morning of the week. I do recall it was a public holiday, but my dad was still going into the offices. A meeting had been planned to discuss the merging of the company. 2 companies were becoming one. My father was in charge of this metamorphosis, so to speak. My father usually would leave for work very early in the morning, wearing a navy blue pinstripe suit that fitted him marvellously, like a glove, along with a pair of shiny black shoes that were so polished you could probably see your reflection in them. He was always immaculately attired, and gave off this air of importance that demanded respect. On this unassuming morning that felt more like a Saturday than a Friday, everyone in my father's offices was dressing casual. So my dad was wearing a white crisp cotton shirt, casually rolled up at the sleeves, a pair of blue chinos, and a snazzy pair of sneakers, with a really nifty white logo on the side, that I would have liked to have owned myself, because they were so cool. My father had kissed me on the cheek apologetically. "I'm sorry, son, that I have to go off to work this morning. I know it's a public holiday, but I'm in charge of this merger, you see. We need to discuss the trajectory of where the merger is going to ultimately take the 2 companies, as they become one over the course of the next year. There is a lot of adjustments to be made, and I'm the one that has to make all the major decisions in that regard." My father, who was naturally ambitious by nature, enjoyed challenges. He was very excited about this turnaround in the company, as this merger would be very good for our family, with my father's new pay packet looking like something only dreams are made of. "I'll make it up to you, I promise, both of you." Those were the last words my father ever spoke to me and my brother, on that standardly routine day that on the surface seemed like any other. Only this was a day that would end up being the biggest stumbling block in our lives, for this was a day we would never be likely to forget. I was naturally upset, very aggrieved that my father had to go off to work on a public holiday of all things. My dad would normally take me and my brother Hamish out on a special road trip or something. A wildlife sanctuary, perhaps, stuff like that. But on this public holiday, we were stuck at home with my mother. Don't get me wrong, I loved my mother, of course I did, but she was not as adventurous as my father was, so hanging around her could sometimes be a little dull, unless of course Douglas Hughes came around to play with us. My dad took the word exciting to a whole new unexplored level. He owned a Harley Davidson and a dirt bike, so he was cool in every sense of the word. He would take me and my brother fishing, rollerblading, skating, clay pigeon shooting, ice skating, kayaking, everything else besides. It was always fun when my father was around. He'd spoil us at diners with hamburgers and milkshakes, and take us on overnight camping trips. My father did admit to feeling a little off-colour on the public holiday, but he simply put it down to being slightly apprehensive and overawed about the company's merger. But beyond that, he seemed in relatively good form. My mother, however, did confide with us that a week before my dad's tragic demise, he was having insidious nightmares, and they were all about Ravenscroft, which was super weird in itself. "Fancy you're thinking about the old place," my mother had chuckled, thinking nothing of my father's strange dreams. Could he have had some kind of prognostication that our family would ultimately be returning to the formidable place? You could only but wonder. My father worked out regularly to keep his body in excellent shape. He ate an incredibly healthy diet of mainly meat and vegetables. He abandoned all products that contained sugar or preservatives. So we likely thought he'd live forever, unlike Mr. Gromjola, who lived next door to us. Mr. Gromjola was in his early 30s and was so big he couldn't even walk out of his front door straight. He had to turn his body at an angle, and he always struggled to fit in the front seat of his rather clapped-out maroon SUV that had almost certainly seen better days. Mr. Gromjola's extensive stomach frequently got jammed behind the wheel of his car. My father sometimes had to help him out of his car, which must have been pretty humiliating for the poor man. Mr. Gromjola was so big that I felt sorry for him, especially since his eyes seemed to be buried beneath mounds of flesh, and I wondered if he could actually see clearly out of them, with all the obstruction of skin in the way. The unfortunate man seemed to roll everywhere, like an inflated beach ball bouncing down the promenade of the beach. He would tell us he had a very bad flailing metabolism, and that he ate nothing but lettuce and tomatoes all the time. He claimed it was nothing but a medical mystery as to why he was so obese, and even the doctors could not understand his strange predicament. I was horrified that somebody who claimed to live on rabbit food, most especially tomatoes and lettuce, could be that large. I asked my father about it, as I was genuinely perturbed about the matter. My father said that Mr. Gromjola would not be the size he was if he ate rabbit food, because that would be physically impossible. "I suspect he eats a lot more than he claims he does," my father told us. "Some people just don't want to admit the truth, because they feel ashamed. I suspect Mr. Gromjola is embarrassed to be the size he is." Me and my brother once sifted through Mr. Gromjola's rubbish out of curiosity, because we couldn't understand the enigmatic mystery of how he could be so big if he claimed he ate virtually nothing. So we did some investigating of our own to find out if there was any explanation to his obesity, and it turns out the evidence was all in his dustbin. We really didn't have to search terribly far. It overwhelmingly pointed out to the fact that Mr. Gromjola ate a massive amount of food. By the looks of things, he ate what a family of 4 would eat in a week in one day. I found it unfathomable that one person could consume that much. Was it any surprise he was so large? Beyond that, we often saw takeaway delivery vehicles delivering stuff to his front door. But Mr. Gromjola claimed all his deliveries were from the healthy gourmet in town. He told us he was ordering the reduced-calorie meals and plenty of salads. Me and my brother, to the contrary, did not find anything from the healthy gourmet in town. Instead, we found pizza boxes, donut boxes, and so forth. So I think Mr. Gromjola was deluding himself when he claimed to eat so very little. Of course, I did confront him once with the evidence, and he insisted the stuff we'd found in his dustbin was stuff his brother ate when he was visiting him. But I didn't believe a word of it. I was to later learn Mr. Gromjola didn't even have a brother. The overweight man did admit to being on hundreds of medications for a multitude of problems, which he told us would go away if he lost the weight he was carrying. My father kindly invited him to go to the gym with him, but Mr. Gromjola refused, saying it wouldn't do him any good, because he could barely walk up the road without getting seriously out of breath. "I'm in a very bad way, he would say, patting his stomach so sorrowfully and wheezing like an asthmatic as he tried to breathe. "I barely eat anything. Salad all the time. Tomatoes and lettuce. I never eat anything else. My heart is all stuffed up, so I have to stay at home all the time. It's the way it is, I'm afraid. The good Lord made me this way. There's nothing I can do about it. Nothing at all." "What does the doctor say about your health, Mr. Gromjola?" I asked.
"Oh, the doctors don't understand why I'm like this. They can't understand. I told them how few calories I eat every day. I'm nothing short of a medical mystery, let me tell you that."
What I'd never have expected to happen, that my father, who was a beacon of health, would just drop down dead in the way he did. If it had happened to our next-door neighbour, Mr. Gromjola, that would have been a different matter. I wouldn't have actually been that surprised. for he was tormented daily by a plethora of health problems. He was always telling us his doctor said if he didn't lose the weight, his health would be seriously compromised. He had a fatty liver, high blood pressure, blood sugar levels that were through the roof. Furthermore, he had aches and pains and very poor circulation. But my father, he was a pinnacle of health and of well-being. So why was he the one that had ended up dead? It made no sense to me at all. And at 13 years old, it made me aware that none of us are invincible, even if we do take good care of ourselves. Even the coroner could not find the cause of my father's mysterious death, and seemed rather reticent and reluctant to tell my mother that she had no idea why he died. She did, however, find a selection of handprints, all in the form of dark bruises, around my father's neck in a cluster, which was profoundly odd, because it looked like someone had tried to strangle my father, but that was not how he died. I think the coroner clearly did not like to be put in an embarrassing, awkward position like this, of being equally as stumped as the family was, as to the cause of my dad's mysterious death. "But there has to be a reason that my husband died," my mother insisted. "People just don't drop down dead for no reason, surely. And what about these strange cluster of fingerprints that you found around his neck? Are you sure that had nothing to do with his death?" "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Sanchez. I cannot explain the bruising around your husband's neck. But unfortunately, losing a loved one like this can happen. I'm terribly sorry for your loss. It has got nothing to do with the bruising around his neck as to why he died. Sometimes in my line of business, we have cases that mystify us, even as the professionals. Your husband is one of those enigmatic cases, I'm afraid. It happens to babies too, Mrs. Sanchez, when they die for no reason at all. We call that sudden infant death syndrome in babies. Your husband's death is in much the same line as that." Regretfully, my immediate family were given absolutely no closure in regards to my dad's very devastating death. We could not establish any logical reason or explanation for why he died, although my mother's psychic friend Chloe didn't make things any easier when she told my mother ever so nonchalantly, "I told you something was drawing you away from Nevada, did I not? But be careful about that dark energy I warned you about. As far as Kenneth is concerned, it was his time to go. We all have exit points in our lives. Your husband chose to take his. He obviously finished what he intended to accomplish here on Earth." My mother didn't believe that for a single second, that my dad would willingly abandon his family and kids like this, as there were so many things he still wanted to accomplish in his life. Furthermore, he was very excited about the expansion of the company business. It was later in the morning of the public holiday, when my dad had left for work on that unfortunate day, that our lives were forever changed. Me and my brother were happily and very innocently making homemade hamburgers for lunch, with only the finest high-quality Aberdeen Angus grass-fed minced beef. My mother was mixing the hamburger patties together with chopped herbs, spices and onion. All of a sudden there was a knock at the front door. My mother's hands were heavily caked in mince. "Talk about bad timing," she said, looking up at us from the bowl and frowning. "We aren't expecting any company, are we? You didn't invite Douglas Hughes over, did you, kids?" "No," I said. "Douglas is away with his parents. They've gone on a camping trip." My mother speedily washed the mincemeat gunk off her hands under the kitchen sink. She wiped her hands dry on the apron that she was wearing, which she hurriedly removed from her person and hung on the hook at the back of the door. "Just stay there, kids, will you?" she said, raising her hand like a lollipop lady at a pedestrian crossing. She was inadvertently telling us in her sign language to stay put. "I'll get that. I won't be a minute." While my mother scurried away to the front door, me and my brother Hamish glanced briefly out of the kitchen window, but something grabbed our attention. We had both noticed a police vehicle, parked on the street directly opposite our home. "It's the police!" I said to my brother in astonished confoundment. I pointed towards the police car that was parked on the pavement. "What are they doing here? They're not visiting us, are they?" Me and my brother exchanged bewildered glances together, and with curiosity ultimately getting the better of us, we quickly scrambled out of the kitchen, like two rockets in takeoff, eager to see what was going on. We stopped short in our tracks as we stood in the entrance hall, observing my mother as she pulled back the chain lock and slowly but surely opened the door. I heard the low, earnest mumble of voices, one which was very conspicuously my mother's. I heard her saying, "What is this about, officers? Has something happened?" "Might we come in for a moment, ma'am? Have a word with you," came one of the voices. My mother said, "But of course, follow me." She gestured for the uniformed officers to come into the house. I noticed at once that their demeanour was solemn and sullen, and so my heart began to do a series of flip-flops in my chest. I guess I could sense that something was really off, and somehow the burgers we were going to cook for lunch had lost their appeal, as a bitter taste swept across the back of my throat. On seeing us, my mother waved her hands at us. "Go back to the kitchen, kids. I'll be with you in a moment. I just need to speak to these nice officers for a second. But I won't be long, I promise you that." Me and my brother scooted away obediently, while my mother closed the living room door behind her. Then a while later, I heard her scream, "No! No! Please, God, no! This can't be true! It can't be!" My mother's words were so horrifically haunting, I felt as if someone had plunged a knife into my own guts. My blood turned as cold as ice. My body trembled and shook like a blancmange jelly. Something terrible had happened. I could feel it in every part of my being, and even my bones began to rattle. My brother looked visibly shaken after he'd heard my mother scream. It was a gut-wrenching cry that you never ever forget. I heard heavy boots trudging towards the kitchen. One of the officers came in and asked me where the stuff was to make tea for my mother. "Your mother needs a good cup of sweet tea," he said. Me and my brother said nothing as we watched the officer boil a kettle, and then finally load my mother's cup with both milk and an excess of sugar. "What happened?" I asked. "I heard Mummy screaming. Is everything all right? What's going on?" The officer smiled at us rather bashfully. "Your mother's just had a little shock, that's all. But don't worry about it. I'm sure she will tell you about it soon enough." The officer was annoyingly not very forthcoming about anything. He gave us both sympathetic looks that suggested he felt pity for us. I knew at once that someone was dead. There was no doubt about it in my mind. I wasn't stupid. Police didn't make house calls for no good reason. My first ominous thought was that something dreadfully bad had happened to poor Granny May. Maybe one of her witchy experiments, using herbal concoctions that she brewed on the stovetop in her black cauldron, had accidentally killed her. Granny May would wander off into the woods, picking flowers, wild garlic, berries, grasses and fungi indiscriminately to make herbal tinctures and spells. My mother was terribly worried about this strange practice of hers, as on one occasion Granny May had picked several poisonous mushrooms that she had added to her brew. Had my mother not spotted them in time, they might have killed her. On this occasion, had she accidentally picked a poisonous plant by any chance, that she assumed was benign? Maybe she had intaken it, ingested it in some way. Or worse still, was the monster that me and my brother had seen, that lived in the woods, finally gobbled her up? Frankly, I was still surprised that Granny May was still alive, with that hideous thing lurking around in the woods, always watching, always waiting. Frankly, it was amazing he hadn't eaten her up already. The last person I ever envisaged for a single moment that would be dead was my father. In fact, I never gave that thought a fleeting regard. Later that day, with red eyes and a puffy-looking face, my mother had taken us into the living room and told us she had something to tell us. "It's your father," she said. "Dad," I said. "Is he all right, Mum?" "No, sweetheart. I'm sorry, Alistair, he's not. Your father is not all right." She said the words with a cracked voice.
as if her voice was breaking under the weight of what she was telling us.
Is he in hospital? Has he been in an accident? Is that why the police were here?
I asked. I now became unduly alarmed, as you would expect. I could feel the panic rising from my belly button, right up to the back of my throat, like a rambunctious, big, overexcited tsunami wave, bringing with it trepidation and terror. I knew with a certainty what my mother would say next, and that it would have long-reaching repercussions over our lives. It seems I wasn't wrong, as it absolutely did. Somewhere deep, buried within my gut, an insidious gnawing feeling was telling me what my mother was about to say. It turned out my prognostication was alarmingly accurate. Your father is never coming back. He died this morning when crossing the street with a work colleague to go and pick up some breakfast at the coffee shop over the road, before the major meeting about the merger. I'm so sorry, loves. Tears spilled down my mother's cheeks as she looked at us through her red-rimmed eyes and blew her nose loudly in a tissue. No, it can't be true, I cried up. You're lying to us. Daddy's not dead. He can't be dead. There's no way he's dead. Don't say things like that, Mum, when they're not true. I'm sorry, sweetheart, but it is true. Your father is dead. But how could he just die? I asked nonplussed. There was nothing wrong with him. He was healthy. He doesn't have health problems like Mr. Gomjoli next door. Apparently your father collapsed on the street. Why that happened, I do not know. Samuel Evans was with him at the time. They were picking up some foodstuff to bring back to the office before the meeting, before the meeting transpired. Samuel said 1 minute your father was having a joke with him, and the next he went down like a pack of cards on the street. Pedestrians everywhere came to his aid, like ants out of an anthill. One of them was a doctor, would you believe? They discovered he wasn't breathing, and they couldn't do anything to revive him. Believe me, they tried. But there was no response, no heartbeat, nothing. The police arrived on the scene, and the ambulance team announced him dead. My mother burst into floods of tears. Oh, I never expected this to happen to us. It's so unfair, isn't it? Your father took such good care of himself. How could this happen? It makes no sense whatsoever. He did everything to live a healthy life, and it was cruelly taken from him like this. Me and my brother stared at my mother with incredulous wide eyes. We did not cry at first. The sobering news was far too surreal to take on board. There had to be a grievous mistake. My father was the epitome of good health. It couldn't have been him that had died. But my mother's face revealed our very worst fears. She read our thoughts as clear as the day. It is your father, Alistair. There is no doubt about that. Remember, Samuel Evans was with him when it happened. He confirmed it was your father that died and collapsed on the street. Furthermore, the officer gave me his watch. My heart sank like a heavy stone, being flung into a great big lake. For I knew my father would never remove the watch my mother had given him on their wedding day. He loved that watch with a passion. So if the officer removed it from my dad's body, then it was indeed my father that had been found dead. In that indelible, heart-wrenching moment, reality leered at me with its cold, cruel, heartless eyes, and I had to ingest its bitter gall. And so in that formidable second, I ran to the loo and regurgitated the contents of my stomach until my stomach hurt so much that I couldn't bring anything else up. For a long time, me and my brother stared vacuously into space. "Dad's dead," I said, trying to make the words I was saying seem real. I repeated them a plethora of times so that they'd finally sink in. Even after throwing up in the bathroom, I just could not get my head around this bitter, unwelcome truth. My mother nodded. "That's right, Alistair, he's dead. I'm so sorry, kids. I don't know what to say. It's too dreadful for words. What a nightmare this day has been. But don't you worry, my loves. We'll somehow get through this. You know how upbeat and positive your father always was. The last thing he'd want was for us to be sad."
Me and my brother ran into my mother's arms. The three of us began to weep together, united in our great grief. The remnants of the meat concoction my mother had prepared and left in the bowl to make hamburger patties remained untouched and was never made into patties, but instead given by me very discreetly to Mr. Gomjola's very appreciative bulldog. None of us had the stomach to eat, for our appetites had abandoned us. Indeed, I thought I would probably never ever eat again. With my dad gone from our lives, what was the point of anything any more? The worst part of it all was that my mother was a stay-at-home mother, with no skills to her repertoire. She had married my father at 21 years old. She had never worked a single day in her life. My father had assured her there was no need for her to work. He would take care of the family's need and bring in the steady income which he had done. But over the last year, my father's mother was sadly diagnosed with an aggressive form of bladder cancer. His mother's cancer treatment had eaten so much of the family's money up, as her extortionate medical costs were crippling. And my grandmother, who was so absent-minded, had failed to pay her medical insurance because she had clean forgotten about it, so the policies had collapsed. My dad had insisted on giving her the very best that healthcare could provide, and it would seem all our money was whittled away. Worse still, it hadn't helped my grandmother in the slightest. She had sadly died a few months later, without any noticeable improvements to her deteriorating, declining health, despite all the chemotherapy she had endured to prolong her life. But prolong her life it did not. My father's bank balance was in a bleak state. The irony of ironies is 2 weeks before my father died, he had spontaneously cancelled his life insurance policy. Talk about very bad timing.
"With the merger happening with my company," he told my mother, "I've decided to cancel my life insurance policy for the time being, as our finances are in a bleak state and need to recover. It'll only be for a very short while, so don't worry about it," he told my mother. "Until our finances look a little rosier. We need to get some bills paid, and then I will resume my insurance policies with a new company that Samuel Evans reckons is a great deal better." My mother had been disquieted about this manoeuvre on my father's part. You didn't do incredulous things like this. She saw it as taking unnecessary risks. "You scare me doing this, Kenneth," she had said, "even if it is for the short term. I know we're a little skint at the moment, thanks to your mother's excessive extortionate cancer treatments, but it's not the end of the world, is it? We'll get through this. But cancelling your life insurance policy is like tempting fate, don't you think? If something dreadfully bad were to happen to you, how would I take care of the kids? I have no essential life skills. Who would ever want to employ me? You're playing a dangerous game, love, and I don't like it one bit." "What do you mean?" my father had asked her. "Well, if you quit paying the life insurance, even if it is only for a short while, I worry that the very moment you stop paying, that's exactly when something bad might happen. I couldn't bear anything untoward to happen to you. If you weren't around, how would I cope? How would I provide for our children? I would have no choice but to move back to Ravenscroft to live with my mother. You know how unorthodox and idiosyncratic that woman can be. And the children were never happy living there. They never liked the place." "Nothing's going to happen to me, love. You're far too superstitious. But then again, you were raised by that very superstitious mother of yours, so she would probably make you think like that. Look at me. I'm as fit as a fiddle, am I not?" he said, slapping his cast-iron stomach proudly. "Not an ounce of fat on me anywhere. No high blood pressure, no cholesterol, no blood sugar problems. Even the doc says I'm good to live forever. Nobody lives forever, love. Even you know that. And I'm not even talking about your health. Don't you get it, Kenneth? Believe it or not, there are other ways people's lives can be cut short. People die in car accidents all the time, do they not? Or accidents in the home or workplace. You're not invincible, Kenneth, for God's sake. I wish you would realize that. Your cancelling this life insurance policy is a red flag to me. It's freaking me out, it really is. It's a foolish, very foolish thing to do. I'm sorry, I can't help being superstitious about the matter. But it's got nothing to do with my mother's influence over my life. I'd never ever walk under a ladder, nor would I cancel any insurance policies. And the latter is a harebrained thing to do. I'm sorry, but it is. You should know better, Kenneth. Don't you worry, my love. As soon as we're financially a lot better off, we can resume payment. In the meantime, nothing is going to happen to me. Now, if I was Mr. Gomjola next door, I would hang on to my life insurance policies as tightly as I possibly could, and never let them go. But I'm not him, am I? So there's nothing to worry about. My mother told me that in that moment she had an awful, ominous feeling. She knew that if something bad happened to my dad, she would be dependent on a life insurance payout in order to take good care of us. My father did seem to believe he would live forever, in a manner of speaking, because he took great care of himself. But alas, as my mother had said, no one is immortal. My mother had pointed out to my father that health gurus like Robert Atkins, Joseph Pilates, Michel Montignac, and Jim Fixx all had died at young ages, having advocated a healthy lifestyle, with many, many followers, and yet their health advice had not helped them to live a long life themselves. It just goes to show that life is far too short to deprive ourselves of all the nice things that life has to offer us. I myself would be very angry if I got to the other side and realized I'd deprived myself of cheesecake and donuts. And for what? How I wished my father had listened to my mother's cautionary note of warning. Now we were going to have to live with Granny May at Ravenscroft, so our worst fears were being fully realized. I felt so much tangible grief, with Dad no longer being around, but also I felt rather angry towards him for letting Mum down like this. My mother would now be forced to work. She'd probably have to find a job giving her a minimum wage, and that was not exactly going to inspire her with any confidence. And me and my brother Hamish could be stuck indefinitely, living at Ravenscroft for the remainder of our childhoods. One unwelcome thought kept seeping into my mind over and over again. Was that hairy monster still in the woods, I wondered? I bet he was. Knowing our luck, he'd be after us again. And then what about that old man that visited us at the dead of night and stood watching us at the end of our beds? Would he still be there? Me and my brother Hamish knew that what had happened at Ravenscroft had been very real. It didn't help that Granny May fancied herself as a witch, even though my mother had said it was all harmless fun on her part. But I ask you, when is dabbling with the occult completely harmless? Of course it's not. It's probably significantly worse if you don't know what the hell you're doing, because then you can indiscriminately open portals into the unseen realms that you cannot visibly see and let something atrocious through. Granny May was clueless about what she was doing. She had always been very experimental. The tragedy was that no one ever took her very seriously, not even my mother. So when she said she was a witch, nobody really paid attention. But she was always playing around with that dog-eared book of spells of hers. The biggest misfortune of all was that she had no mentors working in the occult with her to give her sound advice, so that she could always be guarded from doing anything stupid. Granny May performed all manner of rituals. I knew this because I'd seen her doing so when I'd been living at Ravenscroft. But what if she called up something from the abyss? The thought did not bear thinking about, because if that was the case, moving to Ravenscroft would be worse than we remembered. I could only hope to God that Granny May was not a complete ignoramus. My mother assured me that my grandmother was not stupid, but I could easily imagine her playing with a Ouija board, and I had heard horrifying reports of such things,
especially from our pastor at church. Our next-door neighbour, Mr. Gomjoli, was visibly very upset when he heard the tragic news about Dad's fortuitous passing. Me, my brother and mother were taken aback by his emotional outburst. It touched us to the quick.
"Oh my God! Kenneth is dead! It can't be true! It can't be true!"
he said, shaking his head furiously.
"I'm so sorry, Mr. Gomjoli,"
my mother had said kindly.
"I know you liked my husband a lot. We're very devastated he died like this, but I'm afraid it is true. Oh my God! This is awful, awful news,"
said Mr. Gomjoli, tears spilling down his well-upholstered cheeks, which he dabbed away with a tissue.
"I never expected this to happen. Kenneth was a very good man," he wailed. "He was helping me change my diet and lifestyle, you know. I was making good progress with him. He came over to my house with some weights, and he became like a personal trainer to me, out of the goodness of his heart, you know. He didn't want any payment from me. Your husband, Mrs. Sanchez, was the very best."
"You mean my Kenneth organized an exercise program for you?" my mother asked in astonishment.
"He never told me this, Mr. Gomberly. You do surprise me. It seems my husband is a dark horse." "Yes, he did," said Mr. Gomjoli. "It was our secret. I've already lost 23 kilos, thanks to your husband," he told us proudly. "He told me he wasn't going to live next door to me and watch me steadily kill myself with my overeating, my lack of exercise. Now he's the one that's gone. How is that even fair? I'm the one that's been filling myself with garbage for all these years. Yet it's your husband that's the one that's died. It's a real wake-up call to me, Mrs. Sanchez, let me tell you. I'm going to lose this weight once and for all," said Mr. Gomjoli firmly, "in honour of your husband's memory. I'm going to do it for him."
"But I thought you said you didn't know why you were so fat, Mr. Gomjoli," I said. "You told us you lived on rabbit food, lettuce and tomatoes. You said your weight was a medical mystery that baffled your doctors."
Mr. Gomjoli flushed, his face growing as red as a London bus. "Don't believe everything you hear, young man. I was just refusing to take accountability for myself. I was in denial about how much I was eating. Ostensibly admitting you have a problem, as your father wisely told me, is the very first step to healing. If you want to know the truth, young man—"
"It's Alistair," I reminded him.
"Well, Alistair, I've been putting away volumes of food for many long years, stuffing my face with all the food items you found in my garbage a while back. They were not my brother's, they were mine. The truth is I didn't have a brother. I made him up. Nor do I ever visit the healthy gourmet in town. I wasn't always this fat, you know."
"You mean you've been thin before?" I asked Mr. Gomjoli in disbelief, as if the very idea of him being thin was close to impossible.
"Don't look so shocked, young man. I'll have you know I was a quarterback in my day, and the girls didn't half fancy me. I was quite the looker, you know, even if I say so myself. You stay there, Alistair, and I'll prove it to you."
Mr. Gomjoli eagerly scuttled back into his house, his whole body heaving and groaning under his massive girth. When he returned, he proudly produced a skinny photograph of himself when he was in his teens. He did look rather like a quarterback and was in astonishingly good shape. To say I was dumbfounded by the photograph was an understatement.
"Mr. Gomjola, you really look exceptionally good. Very fit in this photograph. Is it really you?" "Yes, it is me."
"But are you being serious, Mr. Gomjoli? You look amazing. You've got a physique like my father had in this photograph. You look really, really ripped."
"It was me," said Mr. Gomjoli, "and it will be me again. I'm very tired of being this way. Your father made me put this photograph up on my fridge to remind me that I need to get back into shape. And it's working a treat, I have to say. Every time I think about ordering another doner kebab, Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken or deep pan pizza, I look at this photograph and then I make a better choice.
What made you get so big, Mr. Gomjoli, if you don't mind me asking?
I asked. My mother's death, he said sadly, a tear sliding down his cheek. When she died, I felt so desperately lonely. There was a vacuous, empty space in my heart that needed filling. I suppose I used food. I know what you're going through, young man. Sorry, Alistair, losing your father like you've done. But don't turn to food for comfort like I did. Let's just say it's not worth it. Take it from me. I have to go to bed every night with precautionary oxygen. I wear a mask over my face for my sleep apnea, in case I stop breathing during the night. I'm taking a ton of medications that have hundreds of side effects. I have ulcers all over my legs and feet that are failing to heal due to my diabetes. All these problems would go away if my addiction to food would go as well. It's become like a life sentence to me, if you understand.
When my family returned to the neighbourhood a year later to visit Douglas Hughes and his family, we went knocking at Mr. Gomjoli's front door to say hello. A skinny, good-looking guy answered the door. It came as a shock to us that the man who answered the door was Mr. Gomjoli himself. We barely recognised the man. He was so incredibly changed. He gave my dad all the credit for the miraculous transformation to his health. He was no longer on high blood pressure medications, nor was he diabetic any longer. He was prepping himself to run in the Boston Marathon. We couldn't believe it was the same man. And to know my dad was the inspiration for his astonishing metamorphosis brought me great comfort. So there we are. That's the end of part 2. Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. And that is when the family moved to Ravenscroft. So we're going to find out what happens then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.